The stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of the weathered general store, and Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against her stomach, trying to calm the swarm of butterflies that had taken residence there for the past 3 days of travel from Boston to this dusty Wyoming town called Silver Creek in the summer of 1882. She had exchanged 12 letters with James Thornton over the course of 6 months, each one more tender than the last. But words on paper could never prepare a woman for the reality of meeting the man she had agreed to marry sight unseen. Through the smudged window, she could see a tall figure standing near a hitching post, his hat pulled low, and even from this distance, she noticed his hands were clenched at his sides, his shoulders rigid with tension that mirrored her own fear. The driver opened the door and offered his weathered hand to help her down, and Clara took a deep breath before accepting it, her traveling dress already covered in a fine layer of dust from the journey. Her trunk would be unloaded in a moment, containing everything she owned in this world. Her mother's wedding dress carefully wrapped in tissue paper, 3 simple day dresses, a Sunday dress of deep blue silk, undergarments, a pair of winter boots, her father's Bible, and a small wooden box containing the daguerreotypes of her parents who had died in a tenement fire 2 years ago. At 22 years old, she had been working as a seamstress in a crowded Boston factory, her fingers constantly pricked and bleeding, her future as bleak as the soot-stained buildings surrounding her boarding house. When her friend Margaret had shown her the advertisement in the newspaper seeking a bride for a Wyoming rancher, Clara had stared at it for 3 days before finally gathering the courage to write her first letter. James had written back within 2 weeks, his handwriting bold and slightly uneven, explaining that he was 26 years old, the owner of a modest cattle ranch 5 miles outside Silver Creek, and that he had been too busy building his herd and his home to court any of the local women properly. He wrote about the mountains that turned purple at sunset, about the clear streams filled with trout, about the endless sky that made a man feel both insignificant and blessed at the same time. His letters had been honest about the hardships too, the brutal winters, the summer droughts, the constant threat of cattle thieves and the occasional conflicts with rustlers passing through. But there had been something in his words, a loneliness that echoed her own, a yearning for partnership and companionship that went beyond mere convenience. Now she stood on the wooden boardwalk, her carpetbag in hand, and looked directly at the man who had written those letters. James Thornton was taller than she had imagined, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders built from years of hard labor. His face was shadowed by his hat brim, but she could see a strong jaw and what appeared to be dark hair. He had not moved from his position near the hitching post, and as she took a tentative step forward, she realized something that sent a wave of unexpected tenderness through her chest. His hands were trembling. Not just a slight tremor, but a visible shake that he was trying desperately to control by gripping his hat, which he had now removed from his head in a gesture of respect. Clara walked slowly toward him, her own nervousness momentarily forgotten in the face of his obvious distress. As she drew closer, she could see his face fully now. He was handsome in a rugged way, with dark brown eyes that were wide with what could only be described as near panic, a straight nose that had been broken at least once, and lips pressed together so tightly they had gone pale. A thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead despite the pleasant temperature of the late afternoon, and when he tried to speak, nothing came out at first except a strange choking sound. "Mr. Thornton," Clara said softly, stopping about 3 feet away from him. "Miss Whitmore," he finally managed, his voice hoarse and strained. He was shaking worse now that she was closer, his whole body seeming to vibrate with nervous energy. "I apologize for my state. I have been standing here for 2 hours, and I believe I have worked myself into quite a condition." Despite her own fear, Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. "I have been nervous for 3 days straight," she admitted. I barely ate anything yesterday, and I did not sleep at all last night. The other passengers on the stagecoach probably thought I was ill." James stared at her, and something in his expression shifted. The panic receded slightly, replaced by wonder. "You are more beautiful than I imagined," he said, and then immediately flushed red. "That was too forward. I apologize. I seem to have lost all sense of proper manners." "I think we are past the point of ordinary manners," Clara said gently. "We have agreed to marry after all. Some honesty between us seems appropriate." She studied him carefully, noting the way his chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, the way his fingers clutched his hat brim so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Would it help if I told you that I am just as frightened as you are?" "You do not look frightened," James said. "You look composed and elegant and completely out of place in this rough town. I keep thinking you will take one look at Silver Creek at me and demand to be put back on that stagecoach heading east." Clara shook her head slowly. "I did not come all this way to turn back at the first moment of uncertainty. I came because your letters gave me hope for a better life, for a true partnership. Unless you have changed your mind about wanting a wife." "No," the word burst from James with such force that several people walking past turned to stare. He lowered his voice, taking a step closer to her. "No, I have not changed my mind. I want a wife. I want you. I have been thinking about this day for months, and the closer it came, the more terrified I became that I would disappoint you somehow, that you would find me lacking." The vulnerability in his voice touched something deep in Clara's chest. She had expected many things from this meeting. Awkwardness, perhaps disappointment, maybe even relief if they found each other agreeable. She had not expected this raw honesty, this immediate intimacy born of shared fear. "Shall we start again?" she suggested. "Perhaps find somewhere to sit and talk properly. I confess my legs are still unsteady from the journey." Relief flooded James's face so completely that he looked years younger. "Yes, of course. There is a restaurant just down the street run by Mrs. Chen. She makes the best beef stew in Wyoming, and her apple pie is famous throughout the territory. We could have supper there, talk, and then I have arranged for you to stay at the boarding house tonight. Mrs. Patterson runs it, very respectable, and she has given you her best room. Tomorrow, if you are still willing, we can be married by Reverend Matthews at the church." Clara nodded, grateful for his consideration in not assuming they would marry immediately upon her arrival. "That sounds perfect. Let me just collect my trunk." James finally seemed to shake off some of his paralysis. He strode to the stagecoach with purpose, his nervousness temporarily overridden by the need to be useful. Clara watched as he hefted her heavy trunk onto his shoulder as though it weighed nothing, the muscles in his arms and back flexing beneath his worn cotton shirt. He settled their arrangements with the driver, then gestured for Clara to walk beside him down the main street of Silver Creek. The town was smaller than Clara had expected, consisting of perhaps 24 buildings lining a wide dirt road. There was the general store, a saloon from which piano music and male laughter drifted, a blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil created a steady rhythm, the boarding house with its neat white paint and green shutters, a small schoolhouse, the church with its simple wooden cross, and various other establishments including what appeared to be a land office and a telegraph station. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in July, and the air smelled of pine and dust and horses. "It is not Boston," James said quietly, watching her take in the scene. "No, it is not," Clara agreed. "Boston is crowded and dirty and loud in a different way. The factories belch smoke day and night, and the streets are filled with people who never look at each other, who are too busy trying to survive to notice the humanity around them. This is different. Quieter, cleaner in its way." They reached the restaurant, a modest building with whitewashed walls and checkered curtains in the windows. The sign above the door read Chen's Eatery in both English and Chinese characters. James set Clara's trunk on the covered porch, then opened the door for her. Inside, the space was simple but spotlessly clean, with 6 tables covered in white cloths and a delicious aroma of cooking meat and herbs filling the air. A small Chinese woman emerged from the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw James. "Mr. Thornton, your bride has arrived." She turned her sharp eyes on Clara, looking her up and down with an assessing gaze that reminded Clara of her mother. "Pretty girl. Good strong frame, you will have healthy babies." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, a younger Chinese woman appeared from the kitchen, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, with delicate features and curious eyes. "Mama, you are embarrassing them," she said in perfect English with no trace of an accent. "Truth is not embarrassing," Mrs. Chen said firmly, but she gestured them to a table by the window. "Sit, sit. I will bring you my special stew and fresh bread. You must be hungry from your journey, Miss Whitmore." As they settled into their chairs, Clara found herself relaxing slightly. The restaurant felt welcoming, and Mrs. Chen's forthright manner was oddly comforting. Across the table, James had set his hat on an empty chair and was running his hand through his dark hair, making it stand up in all directions. His hands had finally stopped shaking, though Clara could see the tension still present in the set of his shoulders. "Tell me about your ranch," Clara said, wanting to fill the silence with something concrete. "Your letters described it, but I would like to hear more." James leaned forward, and as he began to speak about his land, his voice grew stronger and more confident. "I have 200 acres along Silver Creek, which is how the town got its name. The water runs year-round, fed by snowmelt from the mountains, and it provides good grazing for my cattle. I have about 100 head right now, mostly Herefords, though I have been considering bringing in some Longhorns for their hardiness. The house is modest, just 3 rooms currently, a main living area with the kitchen and a table, a bedroom, and a small storage room. But I built it with expansion in mind. The walls are solid pine logs, chinked properly to keep out the winter cold, and I installed glass windows instead of just shutters. There is a good stone fireplace that heats the whole space efficiently. It sounds like you have worked very hard," Clara said, watching his face as he spoke. His eyes had lost that panicked look, replaced by pride and enthusiasm. "I have been building this place for 4 years," James admitted. "I came west from Ohio after my parents died of cholera. I was 22, had a small inheritance from the sale of their farm, and I wanted to start fresh somewhere new. I worked as a ranch hand for old Walter McConnell for 2 years, learning everything I could, saving every penny. When he decided to retire and sell off portions of his land, I was able to buy my acreage from him. The first year was brutal. I lived in a tent while I built the house and the barn, worked dawn to dusk every single day and barely survived the winter. But each year has gotten a little easier, a little more prosperous." Mrs. Chen's daughter brought out 2 bowls of steaming stew, thick with chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions in a rich brown gravy. The bread was warm from the oven, and Clara realized she was genuinely hungry for the first time in days. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, and Clara was pleased to discover that the food was indeed delicious, hearty and satisfying after her long journey. "What made you answer my advertisement?" James asked suddenly, setting down his spoon and looking at her directly. "I know you mentioned in your letters that you worked in a factory, but surely there were men in Boston who would have courted you. You are educated, well-spoken, and beautiful. You could have had your pick." Clara set down her own spoon and met his gaze. "The men in Boston who might have courted me wanted either a wealthy wife or a woman who would bring connections and social standing. I am an orphan with no family, No inheritance, and no prospects beyond working my fingers to the bone in a factory for wages that barely paid for my room and board. The other men, the workers in the factories, they were struggling just as much as I was. I watched my friend Sarah marry a dock worker, and within a year she had a baby, no money, and a husband who drank away what little he earned. I wanted something different. I wanted a partner, someone building something real, someone who would value me for more than just my ability to keep house or bear children. James absorbed this, nodding slowly. And you think I might be that person, based on 12 letters? I think you might be, Clara said honestly. Your letters were thoughtful. You asked me about my opinions on things, not just superficial questions. You told me about your dreams, your failures, your fears. You treated me like an intelligent person capable of understanding the realities of frontier life. So yes, I took a risk in coming here. But it seemed like a better risk than staying where I was, growing old and bitter in a city that cared nothing for me. Something shifted in James's expression, a wall coming down that Clara had not even realized was there. I worried that you might be desperate, he said softly. That you were simply fleeing something, not coming towards something, but I understand now. You made a choice, a deliberate decision based on what you wanted your life to be. That takes courage. We both took a risk, Clara pointed out. You placed that advertisement not knowing what kind of woman might respond. I might have been awful. A small smile tugged at James's lips, the first genuine smile Clara had seen from him. It transformed his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes and revealing a warmth that had been hidden beneath his nervousness. You might still be awful. We have only been in each other's company for an hour. Clara found herself smiling back. That is true, I might snore, I might be terrible at cooking, I might have a violent temper. Do you? Snore, cook badly, or have a temper? I do not snore, according to my roommate in Boston. I am a competent cook, though not a fancy one. And I have a temper when roused, but it takes a great deal to rouse it. I am generally even-tempered and practical. James picked up his spoon again, his movements more relaxed now. I snore sometimes, especially when I have been working outside in the cold and my nose gets congested. I can cook basic things. Beans, bacon, beef, bread if I have time to let it rise. I have a temper too, though I have learned to control it over the years. I do not drink to excess, I do not gamble beyond the occasional friendly card game, and I do not keep company with loose women. The frank exchange of information felt strange and yet entirely appropriate. They were negotiating the terms of their life together, establishing expectations and boundaries. Clara appreciated the honesty even as she felt herself blushing at some of the topics. They finished their meal, talking about smaller things. Books they had read, memories of their childhoods, their opinions on everything from politics to religion. Clara discovered that James was well-read despite his rough exterior, that he had opinions on the growing railroad expansion and concerns about how it would change the character of the West. He was thoughtful and listened carefully when she spoke, asking questions that showed he valued her perspective. When Mrs. Chen brought out 2 slices of apple pie, the crust golden and flaky, the filling sweet and fragrant with cinnamon, Clara felt a sense of contentment settling over her. This was going better than she had dared hope. James was kind, honest, and while still somewhat nervous, he had relaxed considerably over the course of their meal. I should walk you to the boarding house, James said as they finished their pie. It will be dark soon, and while Silver Creek is generally safe, I would feel better seeing you settled properly. They left the restaurant, James once again shouldering Clara's trunk with ease. The sun was indeed setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, the mountains standing in stark silhouette against the colorful display. Clara found herself stopping to stare, having never seen anything quite so beautiful. "It is like this most evenings," James said softly, standing beside her. "I never get tired of it." Back in Ohio, the sky was pretty enough, but here it is different, bigger somehow, more dramatic. "It is breathtaking," Clara whispered. They stood together in silence for a long moment, watching the colors shift and change. Then James cleared his throat. "We should go before it gets full dark." The boarding house was indeed respectable, as James had promised. Mrs. Patterson was a plump, cheerful widow in her 50s who welcomed Clara warmly and showed her to a comfortable room on the second floor. The room was small but clean, with a brass bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a small wardrobe, and a rocking chair by the window. James set the trunk at the foot of the bed, then stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I will come by at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said. "If you are still willing, we can walk to the church together. Reverend Matthews is expecting us, and Mrs. Chen and her daughter have offered to serve as witnesses. Afterward, I thought we could have a wedding lunch at the restaurant, and then I would take you out to the ranch. But if you need more time, if you want to wait another day or even a week, I will understand." Clara looked at this man who had been shaking with nerves just a few hours ago, this man who had been honest and kind and thoughtful throughout their evening together. She thought about his letters, about the life he was offering, about the alternative waiting for her back in Boston. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning will be perfect," she said firmly. The relief and joy that flooded James's face was almost painful in its intensity. "Truly, truly. I came here to marry you, James Thornton, and unless you have changed your mind, that is exactly what I intend to do." He stepped forward impulsively, reaching for her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip gentle despite his obvious emotion. "I have not changed my mind. I want this. I want you. I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy, to be a good husband, to build a good life together." Clara squeezed his hand. "And I promise to be a true partner to you, to work beside you, to build this life together. We will figure out the rest as we go." James lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and old-fashioned that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Then he released her, stepped back, and put his hat on his head. "Sleep well, Clara. I will see you tomorrow morning." "Sleep well, James." After he left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long, shaky breath. Her heart was pounding, but it was not entirely from fear anymore. There was excitement there too, anticipation, and something that might have been the very beginning of affection. She had liked him. That was the simple truth of it. She had liked his honesty, his vulnerability, his strength and his gentleness in equal measure. Tomorrow she would marry him, and the day after that she would begin her new life as a rancher's wife in Wyoming territory. She unpacked her trunk carefully, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her mother's carefully wrapped wedding dress on the rocking chair. The dress was simple but beautiful, cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, fitted at the bodice and flowing in the skirt. Her mother had been married in it 30 years ago in Ireland, and Clara had always dreamed of wearing it at her own wedding. She ran her fingers over the fabric, imagining her mother's joy and her father's pride, wishing they could be here to see this day. That night, Clara slept better than she had expected, falling into a deep, dreamless rest born of exhaustion and relief. When she woke to sunlight streaming through the window, it took her a moment to remember where she was and what day it was. Then it all came rushing back, and her stomach flipped with nervousness. She was getting married today, to a man she had met just yesterday, in a town she had arrived in less than 24 hours ago. She washed carefully with the pitcher and basin, grateful that Mrs. Patterson had provided warm water. She dressed in her mother's wedding dress, which fit perfectly and pinned her dark blonde hair up in a simple but elegant style. She had no jewelry except for a small silver cross that had been her grandmother's, which she fastened around her neck. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked older somehow, more serious but also determined. This was the right choice. She was sure of it. At precisely 9 o'clock, there was a knock at her door. Clara took a deep breath, picked up the small bouquet of wildflowers that Mrs. Patterson had kindly provided, and opened the door. James stood in the hallway, and the expression on his face when he saw her made every moment of fear and doubt worthwhile. He was dressed in clean dark trousers, a white shirt that looked brand new, a black vest, and a string tie. His boots were polished to a shine, and his hair was neatly combed. He looked handsome and nervous and completely overwhelmed. "Clara," he breathed, "you are stunning. I have never seen anything so beautiful in my entire life." She felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." He offered his arm and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her hand. They walked down the stairs together, out into the bright morning sunshine. Silver Creek was already awake, people going about their business, and several townspeople stopped to watch them pass, smiling and calling out congratulations. The church was a simple wooden structure with rough-hewn pews and a plain cross on the wall behind the altar. Reverend Matthews was a kindly-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and gentle eyes. Mrs. Chen and her daughter were already there, both dressed in their finest clothes, smiling broadly as Clara and James entered. The ceremony was brief and simple. Reverend Matthews spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about partnership and commitment, about building a life together based on mutual respect and love. James repeated his vows in a strong, clear voice, promising to love, honor, and cherish Clara for all the days of his life. When it was Clara's turn, she looked directly into James's eyes and made the same promises, meaning every word. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and told James he could kiss his bride, James cupped Clara's face gently in his calloused hands and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. Clara felt something shift and settle in her chest, a rightness that she had not expected to feel so soon. They signed the marriage certificate, Mrs. Chen and her daughter adding their signatures as witnesses, and just like that, Clara Whitmore became Clara Thornton. As they walked out of the church into the bright summer morning, James took her hand and laced his fingers through hers. "How do you feel, Mrs. Thornton?" he asked softly. Clara considered the question seriously. "Married," she said, "and surprisingly happy about it." James laughed, a genuine sound of joy that made Clara smile in return. "I feel the same way." Terrified but happy. The wedding lunch at Mrs. Chen's restaurant was a feast. Roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from Mrs. Chen's garden, light fluffy rolls, and a beautiful cake that Mrs. Chen's daughter had decorated with white frosting and fresh berries. Several townspeople stopped by to offer their congratulations, and Clara was touched by how welcoming everyone seemed. There was Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weathered man in his 50s who told James he was lucky to have found such a fine-looking bride. There was Doc Harrison, the town physician, who offered his services should they need medical care. There was Miss Emily Foster, the schoolteacher, who welcomed Clara warmly and invited her to the ladies' social circle that met on Tuesday afternoons. After the lunch, James brought around his wagon, a sturdy vehicle pulled by 2 strong horses. He helped Clara up onto the bench seat, her trunk secured in the back along with several packages that Mrs. Chen had pressed upon them. Extra food for their larder, she had explained, to help the new bride settle in. Then James climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a click of his tongue set the horses in motion. The ride out to the ranch took about 40 minutes, following a well-worn trail that ran alongside Silver Creek. The landscape was beautiful, rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers, stands of pine and aspen trees, and always the mountains in the distance. Clara could see cattle grazing in the distance, their red and white coloring bright against the green grass. "That is the southeast corner of my property," James said, pointing. "The boundary runs along that line of trees, then follows the creek for about 2 miles, then cuts back west to that rocky outcropping. It is not the biggest ranch in the territory, but it is mine, every acre paid for with honest work." The pride in his voice was evident, and Clara understood it. This was what he had built, his legacy, his future. And now it was her future too. The house came into view, nestled in a small valley with the creek running behind it and a stand of tall pines providing shade on the west side. It was exactly as James had described, a solid log structure with a covered porch, glass windows, and a stone chimney rising from one side. There was a barn nearby, painted red, and a chicken coop from which the sounds of clucking hens could be heard. A large vegetable garden had been planted behind the house, and Clara could see rows of green plants growing vigorously. James pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help Clara descend. But instead of just offering his hand, he suddenly swept her up into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "James," Clara gasped, grabbing his shoulders for balance. "It is traditional for the groom to carry his bride over the threshold," he said, his eyes sparkling with happiness. "I may not know much about fancy customs, but I know that one." He carried her up the porch steps and through the front door, setting her down gently in the middle of the main room. Clara looked around, taking in her new home. The space was rustic, but clean and well-maintained. There was a large stone fireplace with a cast iron pot hanging from a hook, a heavy wooden table with 4 chairs, a kitchen area with a dry sink and shelves stocked with dishes and pots, a comfortable-looking armchair near the fireplace, and colorful rag rugs scattered on the wooden floor. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating everything with a warm glow. "It is not fancy," James said, standing close behind her, "but it is solid and warm and comfortable." "I hope you will be happy here." Clara turned to face him. "It is perfect. It is everything I hoped for." The relief on his face was palpable. "Let me show you the rest." He led her to one of the 2 doors off the main room, opening it to reveal the bedroom. There was a large bed with a simple wooden frame, covered in a colorful quilt similar to the one at the boarding house. A wardrobe stood against one wall, a washstand against another, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. The room was spare but comfortable, and Clara could already imagine ways to make it more personal. Curtains for the window, perhaps a small rug beside the bed, some photographs or paintings on the walls. "And this is the storage room," James said, opening the other door to reveal shelves stocked with preserved foods, sacks of flour and sugar, tools, and various supplies. "It doubles as a pantry. I try to keep at least 6 months of supplies on hand in case of a hard winter." They returned to the main room, and an awkward silence fell between them. They were married now, alone in the house that would be their home, and the reality of their situation suddenly felt overwhelming. James rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture Clara was beginning to recognize as a sign of his nervousness. "I should bring in your trunk," he said finally. "And I need to tend to the horses and check on the cattle. Make yourself at home, explore, whatever you like. There is coffee in the pot on the stove if you want some, and bread in the box by the sink." He retreated quickly, leaving Clara alone in the house. She walked slowly around the space, running her fingers over the furniture, examining the books on the small shelf near the fireplace. There were practical volumes on animal husbandry and agriculture, but also some novels. works by James Fenimore Cooper and Mark Twain, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, and a collection of poems by Walt Whitman. She smiled, pleased to confirm that James was indeed the thoughtful, literate man his letters had suggested. She found the coffee pot and poured herself a cup, surprised to find it was still hot and quite good. She cut herself a slice of bread and spread it with butter from the crock in the cool box, then sat at the table and simply absorbed the reality of her new situation. She was married. She was sitting in her own home. She was beginning a new life in Wyoming territory. James returned with her trunk, setting it carefully in the bedroom. "I will leave you to unpack and settle in," he said. "I really do need to check on the cattle and finish some chores in the barn. Will you be all right alone for a few hours?" "I will be fine," Clara assured him. "I have plenty to do, and I imagine I should start figuring out where everything is and how the household runs." He nodded, relieved, and headed back outside. Clara spent the next few hours unpacking her belongings, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe, arranging her few personal items, and exploring the kitchen supplies. She found eggs in the cool box, fresh vegetables from the garden stored in baskets, and a side of bacon hanging in the storage room. She had promised James she was a competent cook, and she intended to prove it by making a good supper for them tonight. By late afternoon, she had a beef stew simmering over the fire, similar to the one Mrs. Chen had served, but with her own touches. A bit of thyme she had found growing wild near the creek, some bay leaves from the spice shelf, and dumplings floating on top to make it more substantial. She had also made biscuits, which were browning nicely in the Dutch oven buried in the coals, and she had found wild strawberries growing near the garden, which she had washed and placed in a bowl with a bit of sugar. When James came in as the sun was setting, dirty and tired from his work, he stopped in the doorway and stared at the scene before him. The table was set with plates and utensils. The stew was bubbling gently. The smell of fresh biscuits filled the air, and Clara had even found a candle to place in the center of the table. "I could get used to this," he said softly. "I hope you will," Clara replied. "Wash up. Supper is ready." They ate together as the light faded outside, talking about their respective afternoons. James told her about the cattle, pointing out through the window where the best grazing areas were, explaining his plans for expanding the herd next year. Clara told him about exploring the house and the garden, about her plans for putting up preserves from the vegetable harvest, about her ideas for making curtains for the windows. After supper, James insisted on helping her clean up, which surprised and pleased Clara. In Boston, she had seen marriages where the husband considered household work beneath him, where the wife was expected to manage everything domestic while the man did nothing but provide money. But James worked alongside her, washing dishes while she dried, discussing what supplies they might need from town next time they went in. When the dishes were done and the kitchen tidied, they found themselves standing in the middle of the main room, the awkwardness returning. It was their wedding night, and both of them knew what was expected, but neither seemed to know how to bridge the gap between the easy companionship of supper and the intimacy of the marriage bed. "Clara," James said finally, "I want you to know that there is no rush. We barely know each other, and I do not want you to feel pressured or frightened. We can take our time, let things develop naturally between us." Clara felt a rush of affection for this considerate man. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "I am nervous, I will admit. But I am your wife now, and I want to be a true wife to you. Perhaps we could just talk for a while, get more comfortable with each other." Relief washed over James's face. "I would like that." They sat together by the fireplace, James in the armchair and Clara in one of the kitchen chairs she had pulled over. They talked for hours, sharing stories from their childhoods, their fears and hopes, their experiences and dreams. James told her about growing up on his father's farm in Ohio, about the grief of losing both parents within a week of each other to the cholera epidemic, about his decision to come west and start fresh. Clara told him about her childhood in Ireland before her family immigrated when she was 8, about the poverty and struggle of life in Boston, about watching her mother die in the fire that destroyed their tenement building, about her father's death from grief and despair 6 months later. As they talked, the physical distance between them seemed to shrink. James moved to sit on the floor near Clara's chair, leaning back against the armchair. Clara found herself reaching out to touch his hair, which was still damp from where he had washed it before supper. The touch was tentative at first, but James leaned into it, closing his eyes with a soft sigh. "That feels nice," he murmured. Clara ran her fingers through his hair more confidently, and James tilted his head back to look at her. The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting his strong features and making his dark eyes seem even deeper. "You are a good man, James Thornton," she said softly. "I am trying to be the man you deserve," he replied. "You already are." He stood slowly, offering her his hand. Clara took it and let him pull her to her feet. They stood close together, and James cupped her face in his hands just as he had at their wedding. "May I kiss you properly?" he asked. "Please," Clara whispered. This kiss was different from the chaste one at the church. This was deeper, more passionate, full of want and need and the beginning of genuine affection. Clara felt her body respond, leaning into James, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. "Come to bed with me," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because we have to, but because I want to be close to you, because I want to start building this marriage in every way." Clara nodded, suddenly unable to speak. She followed him to the bedroom, her heart pounding. What happened next was tender and awkward and sweet, both of them learning each other, taking their time despite their nervousness. James was gentle and patient, making sure Clara was comfortable, checking in with her, putting her needs before his own. And when it was over, they lay tangled together in the big bed, the quilt pulled up over them, feeling closer than they had any right to feel after knowing each other for such a short time. "Are you all right?" James asked, stroking her hair. "Better than all right," Clara said honestly. "I feel like I made the right choice coming here marrying you." "I know I made the right choice," James said firmly. "Best decision of my life, placing that advertisement. Second best decision was not passing out from nerves when I saw you step off that stagecoach." Clara laughed softly. "You really were shaking worse than I was." "I know." "Absolutely pathetic for a grown man." "Not pathetic, endearing. It showed me you cared, that this mattered to you." James pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "It mattered more than anything. You matter more than anything." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Clara felt a sense of peace and belonging that she had not experienced since before her parents died. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. Clara threw herself into making the house a true home, sewing curtains from fabric James bought for her on his next trip to town, planting flowers near the porch, reorganizing the kitchen to suit her own methods of cooking. She learned to tend the chickens and collect eggs, to milk the cow that James kept in the barn, to work in the vegetable garden pulling weeds and harvesting produce. James taught her to ride one of the horses, a gentle mare named Daisy, so that she could accompany him around the ranch. They would ride out together in the cool mornings, checking on the cattle, repairing fences, looking for any signs of trouble. Clara loved these times, the vast openness of the landscape, the quiet companionship as they worked side by side. She also began to integrate into the community of Silver Creek. She attended the ladies' social circle that Miss Emily Foster had mentioned, meeting the other women of the town. Ranchers' wives like herself, the wives of the shopkeepers and other businessmen, even a few single women who worked as teachers or seamstresses. They welcomed her warmly, sharing advice about dealing with the harsh Wyoming winters, trading recipes and patterns, gossiping about the local happenings. Clara became particularly friendly with Lily Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter. Despite their different backgrounds, they found they had much in common. Both were in their early 20s, both loved to read, both were finding their way in this frontier town. Lily had been born in San Francisco after her parents immigrated from China, and the family had moved to Silver Creek 5 years ago to open their restaurant. She spoke of the prejudice they sometimes faced, the way some townspeople looked down on them for being Chinese, and Clara found herself defending the Chens fiercely when she overheard such talk at the general store. As summer turned to autumn, Clara realized she was genuinely happy. Her marriage to James had deepened from its tentative beginnings into something real and solid. They had learned each other's rhythms and habits, their likes and dislikes, their strengths and weaknesses. They talked every evening over supper, sharing their days, making plans for the future. At night, they came together with increasing passion and intimacy, learning to please each other, to communicate their needs and desires. In early October, Clara realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another week to be sure, then another, before finally confiding in Mrs. Patterson when she went into town for supplies. The older woman immediately sent her to see Doc Harrison, who confirmed what Clara already suspected. She was expecting a child, due sometime in early May. Clara rode home in a daze, her hand pressed against her still flat stomach. A baby. She was going to have a baby. She and James were going to be parents. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. How would James react? Would he be happy? Would he be ready for this responsibility? She need not have worried. When she told him that evening, standing in the kitchen while he washed up for supper, James let out a whoop of joy that probably could be heard all the way in town. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time, telling her over and over how happy he was, how blessed they were, how he was going to be the best father in Wyoming territory. That night, they lay in bed talking about the future with a concreteness they had not had before. James was adamant that they needed to expand the house before winter, adding another room that could serve as a nursery. He wanted to hire a carpenter from town to help him, to make sure it was done properly and quickly. Clara talked about the baby clothes she would need to sew, the blankets and diapers, and all the supplies they would need. They discussed names, arguing playfully about whether they should honor dead relatives or choose something new and fresh. The carpenter, a skilled Swedish immigrant named Lars Johansson, came out to the ranch the following week and worked with James to add a spacious room off the bedroom. It had large windows to let in plenty of light, built-in shelves for storing baby things, and a small stove to keep it warm in winter. Clara sewed curtains and made quilts, preparing a cradle that James built himself from smooth pine wood. The winter that year was harsh, with deep snows and bitter cold that kept them confined to the house for days at a time. But Clara did not mind. She and James spent the long evenings together, reading aloud to each other, playing cards, talking about everything and nothing. James was attentive to her growing discomfort as her belly expanded, rubbing her aching back, helping with the heavier chores, treating her like precious cargo. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing green grass back to the rangeland, Clara was huge and uncomfortable and eager to meet this child who kicked her ribs constantly. James had become increasingly nervous as her due date approached, worried about the dangers of childbirth, about losing her. Clara tried to reassure him, but she was frightened too. She had heard too many stories of women who died in childbirth, and here she was, miles from town, with only her husband and hopefully Doc Harrison when the time came. Her labor started on a warm morning in early May, exactly as Doc Harrison had predicted. James rode to town at breakneck speed to fetch the doctor, then returned to pace nervously outside the bedroom door while Doc Harrison and Mrs. Patterson, who had insisted on coming to help, attended to Clara. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night, and there were moments when Clara thought she might die, when the pain was so intense she could not imagine surviving it. But finally, as dawn was breaking, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the lusty cry of a newborn baby. Doc Harrison held up a squalling infant, red-faced and furious at being thrust into the cold world. "You have a son, Mrs. Thornton, a big, healthy boy." Clara burst into tears of relief and joy. A son? They had a son. Doc Harrison cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Clara's arms. She looked down at the tiny face, the dark hair plastered to his head, the little fists waving indignantly, and fell completely in love. James was allowed in then, and the sight of his face when he saw his son was something Clara would remember for the rest of her life. He approached the bed slowly, as if afraid he might break something, and when Clara held the baby out to him, he took the bundle with trembling hands. "He is perfect," James whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He is absolutely perfect. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for this gift, for this miracle." They named him Samuel, after James's father, and from that moment on, their lives revolved around this tiny person who demanded constant attention. Clara had never been so exhausted in her life, but she had also never been so happy. Watching James with their son, seeing the gentleness and patience and overwhelming love he showed, made her fall even more deeply in love with her husband. The years that followed were busy and full. Samuel grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy little boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. 2 years after Samuel's birth, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, and 2 years after that, another daughter named Margaret. The house had to be expanded again to accommodate the growing family, with James and Lars adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper dining room. The ranch prospered as well. James's herd grew to over 300 head, and he was able to hire 2 ranch hands to help with the work. The cattle brought good prices at market, and slowly but surely, James and Clara built not just a home but a legacy. They became pillars of the Silver Creek community, James serving on the town council, Clara organizing charity drives and helping at the school. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Clara with a gift, a beautiful piano shipped all the way from Denver. It took up a good portion of the main room, but Clara cried when she saw it, remembering how she had loved to play as a child in Ireland, before poverty had stolen such luxuries from her life. She played every evening after that, filling the house with music, teaching the children simple songs. As they sat on the porch one summer evening, watching Samuel, now 12, teaching his sisters to rope a fence post while the sun set over the mountains, James reached for Clara's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Answering my advertisement, coming all this way to marry a stranger." Clara looked at this man who had been shaking with nerves that day at the stagecoach, this man who had become her partner, her lover, her best friend, the father of her children. She looked at the home they had built together, the life they had created through hard work and determination and love. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I am meant to be, with you, with our children in this place. You gave me a home, James, not just a house, but a true home." James lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently just as he had done that first night in Silver Creek. "You gave me everything. A family, a reason to build something that will last beyond my own lifetime, and most importantly, you gave me yourself. I love you, Clara Thornton." I loved you from the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, looking so brave and terrified at the same time. I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "I took a risk on a stranger through 12 letters, and I won the greatest prize of my life." They sat together as the stars came out, listening to their children's laughter, feeling the warm breeze carrying the scent of pine and grass. And Clara thought about that nervous girl who had stepped off the stagecoach 10 years ago. She had been so frightened, so uncertain, so worried about making the wrong choice. But it had been the rightest choice of her life, marrying this good, kind, hard-working man who had been shaking worse than she was because he cared so much about making a good impression. From that fear and nervousness had grown something strong and enduring. A marriage built on mutual respect, a family filled with love, a home that welcomed all who entered, and a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. Clara had come to Wyoming territory seeking security and opportunity, but she had found so much more. She had found love in its truest, deepest form, and she had found her place in the world. As the children finally came in for the night, dirty and happy and chattering about their day, as James stood to help her up from the porch swing, as they all gathered around the big table for a late supper of cold chicken and fresh bread, Clara looked around at her family and felt her heart swell with gratitude. This was her life now, these people were her everything, and she would not trade a single moment of it for all the security and comfort of her old life in Boston. Later, after the children were tucked into bed and the house was quiet, Clara and James lay together in the bedroom that had witnessed so much of their life together. Their nervous wedding night, the births of their children, countless nights of conversation and laughter and intimacy. James pulled her close, his hand resting on her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "Everything. Nothing. How grateful I am for this life, how lucky we are to have found each other." "Not luck," James corrected. "Fate, destiny, providence, whatever you want to call it, we were meant to find each other." "I am sure of it," Clara smiled in the darkness. "You are absolutely right. We were meant to be together, meant to build this life, meant to create this family. And I would not change a single thing about our story, from your nervous shaking at the stagecoach to this very moment." "I was pretty pathetic that day, was not I?" James said with a laugh. "You were human. You were real. You showed me immediately that you were someone who felt things deeply, who cared intensely. It was one of the first things that made me believe we might actually have a chance at happiness together." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and in the knowledge that they had beaten the odds. A mail-order-bride arrangement could have gone so wrong in so many ways, but instead, it had given them everything they had ever wanted. Their story would be told in the family for generations. How great-grandmother Clara had traveled from Boston to marry a stranger. How great-grandfather James had been shaking so badly he could barely speak. How they had taken a leap of faith together and built a legacy of love that endured. Years later, when Samuel brought home his own bride and began building his house on the far corner of the ranch property, when Rose married the new sheriff's son and settled in town, when Margaret became a teacher and moved to Cheyenne, Clara and James remained on the ranch in the house they had built together. They grew old together, their hair turning silver, their movements slower but their love undimmed. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. There were grandchildren running everywhere, the table groaning under the weight of food contributions from 3 generations. James stood up to make a toast, his hand only slightly steadier than it had been that day 50 years ago when he had stood at the stagecoach, stop waiting for his mail-order bride. 50 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I placed an advertisement in a Boston newspaper seeking a wife. It was the best decision I ever made because it brought me Clara. She took a tremendous risk, traveling halfway across the country to marry a man she had never met, and I was so nervous when she arrived that I was shaking worse than she was. But from that uncertain beginning, we built something extraordinary. We built a family, a legacy, a love that has sustained us through every hardship and magnified every joy. So here is to Clara, the love of my life, my partner in everything, the woman who made me the luckiest man in Wyoming territory. Everyone raised their glasses, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face. She looked around at all these people who existed because she had been brave enough to answer an advertisement, because James had been honest enough to show his vulnerability, because they had both been willing to take a chance on each other. "And here is to James," she said, standing beside her husband, "who showed me that true strength lies not in hiding your feelings but in being brave enough to reveal them. Who built me a home when I had nowhere to go, who gave me a family when I had lost mine, who loved me when I was just a frightened girl with nothing to offer but hope. You were shaking that day, my darling, but you have been my rock ever since. I love you now as I have loved you every day for 50 years with my whole heart." They kissed then, to the cheers and applause of their family, two elderly people who had somehow managed to achieve what so many others had not: a marriage of true partnership, genuine affection, and enduring love. And as the celebration continued around them, Clara thought back to that girl stepping off the stagecoach, to that man standing by the hitching post trembling with nerves, and she thanked God or fate or whatever force had brought them together. Their story had been unlikely, improbable, fraught with risk and uncertainty. But it had also been beautiful, true, and ultimately triumphant, a testament to the power of courage and the enduring nature of love found in the most unexpected of places.